The struggle between Horus and Seth stands among the oldest and most influential stories in the Egyptian mythic world. Its importance becomes clear because it appears again and again in the earliest major religious writings that survive from Egypt, texts that reach back to the late Old Kingdom. These early sources do not present mythology as a neat, single storyline. They often preserve fragments, different voices, different versions, sometimes even direct contradictions placed side by side. Yet that is exactly what makes them valuable. By comparing the recurring images and repeated phrases, it becomes possible to see older layers beneath later editions, and to understand why certain details clash. The Horus-Seth conflict is one of the best examples of this. Without recognizing that multiple traditions have been woven together, many of its strange turns simply do not make sense. In these earliest references, the conflict is treated as more than a personal feud. It is described as a deep shock to the fabric of the world, an event associated with fear, disorder, and violence. Some lines place it among the great turning points of existence alongside the most primordial beginnings, as if the disturbance it created belonged to the same category as the forming of the cosmos. The story is framed as something that erupted before stable order was fully in place, before the world had reached the familiar shape later generations took for granted. The language repeatedly suggests terror, upheaval, and a sense that creation itself could be shaken. One of the most striking features in these early accounts is the emphasis on injury. The conflict is remembered not only as a contest for dominance, but as a sequence of wounds that must be healed. The king, in religious speech, is portrayed as the one who restores what has been damaged. The image is not merely symbolic decoration. In this worldview, cosmic balance is tied to physical wholeness. When the gods are harmed, the universe is harmed with them. The king's role is to reverse the damage and return stability. In this tradition, Horus is linked to the loss of his eye, Seth to the loss of his generative power, and even Thoth is sometimes drawn into the fallout, portrayed as having suffered an injury that also demands repair. The healing is described through vivid ritual language, cleansing, restoring, removing harm, wiping away the evil each rival has inflicted on the other. In some passages, the act of purification is imagined almost as a tangible substance moving from one being to another, a force that can soothe, mend, and reset what has been thrown into disorder. Other lines speak even more directly about the wounds, treating them as the most concrete markers of the feud. Horus is said to fall because of the damage to his eye, while Seth is pictured collapsing because of his injury. Sometimes the texts mention only Horus's wound and remain silent about Seth's, and that uneven emphasis is important. It suggests that, in one dominant strand of the tradition, the seizure of Horus's eye is the central event, the spark and the core of the conflict. The story does not pause to explain what happened before it. There is no long build-up, no careful motive offered. Horus and Seth are presented as natural opposites already locked in tension, and Seth appears as the aggressor, the one who initiates the violence. In that same strand, Thoth repeatedly appears on Horus's side, acting as ally, helper, and stabilizing force. The drama is also given a kind of mythic geography. The eye is not simply taken, it is taken in a specific direction of the heavens. The struggle reaches toward the eastern side of the sky, as if the conflict has a visible location on the cosmic map. The stolen eye is imagined as being held there, trapped under Seth's power. The gods are described as moving toward that place in order to negotiate, intercede, or confront Seth about what he has seized. In this setting, flight imagery becomes prominent. Thoth's wing is evoked as a means of passage, almost like a supernatural ferry across a boundary of water or a twisting channel that separates regions of the sky. The king is sometimes placed into this movement as well. Not as a casual observer, but as a participant who crosses to the same zone and takes part in the act of recovering what was lost. Some versions push the imagery further and portray the eye as trying to save itself, springing away or lifting itself as if it were alive. At times, it is described as being carried or placed upon a wing, and the wording becomes difficult, because Seth is not normally imagined as a winged being. That tension is another clue that multiple ideas have been stitched together across centuries. Despite the uncertainty of the picture, the meaning remains clear. The eye is treated as a vulnerable, contested object, something that can be trapped, moved, damaged, and fought over. The texts even suggest brutal acts against it: trampling, breaking, consuming, language that turns the eye into both a symbol and a victim of violence. The sense is that Seth does not merely steal, he tries to ruin what he takes. Eventually, however, the eye is restored. The story does not always describe the same method. In many lines, the recovery sounds like it was achieved by force, as if Horus fought to wrench it back. In at least one version, Horus appears more like a petitioner, asking for the return rather than seizing it. Once it is regained, the eye becomes more than Horus's possession. It turns into a protective power that can be passed on. The king receives it as a safeguard, a living emblem of restored order that shields against Seth's violence and influence. Yet even in this moment of recovery, there is anxiety. The eye must not be taken again. The victory is real, but it is not treated as irreversible. The threat of renewed chaos lingers, which fits the broader tone of these early texts, where cosmic stability is something constantly defended rather than permanently guaranteed. One passage even hints at a different angle entirely, assigning to Seth a role that sounds unexpectedly constructive, as if Seth's touch or presence could somehow help the eye function. That kind of reversal is not unusual in Egyptian religious language, where a figure can be feared in one context and invoked in another, depending on the ritual purpose. It also reflects how older material and newer interpretations could sit together without being fully harmonized. The same myth could be used for protection, intimidation, healing, or legitimacy, and the meaning could shift with the speaker's aim. Up to this point, another major figure remained strangely distant: Osiris. In several early scenes, Osiris appears only indirectly, mainly through the idea that the king is aligned with him and therefore receives the restored eye as an offering or protective force. At first, this does not necessarily prove that Osiris belongs to the core of the Horus-Seth conflict. Yet other lines make one thing unmistakable. Seth is also portrayed as the enemy of Osiris. Some passages speak as though Seth must be punished by Osiris, or as though Osiris endures and lives in order to bring judgment on him. Other statements make Seth's hostility toward Osiris sound persistent, deep, and personal. From there, a second major framework begins to emerge, and it changes the shape of the entire story. In this alternative tradition, the central drama is not the stolen eye, but the attack on Osiris. Seth becomes the great enemy of Osiris first, and the feud between Horus and Seth follows afterward as a consequence. Horus then appears not simply as a rival in a cosmic contest, but as a devoted son, the avenger who confronts his father's killer. This approach makes the conflict feel less like a primeval cosmic shock and more like a later chapter in the Osiris story. Still enormous, still violent, but driven by a chain of family tragedy and retaliation. Even so, the earliest texts rarely describe the murder in blunt, straightforward terms. The references are often brief, indirect, and sometimes frustratingly vague. That may reflect a kind of religious caution. Speaking too clearly about such a crime could be considered dangerous, as if naming the act might invite its power. Still, enough details appear to sketch the outline. Seth attacks Osiris in a specific region, throws him down and leaves him prostrate on the ground near a recognizable landscape feature. The image of Osiris lying on his side recurs with striking persistence. In some versions it is Isis and Nephthys, who search and eventually find him, beginning the long, ritualized mourning that later becomes one of the most famous motifs of Egyptian religion. In another version, Horus is described as finding Osiris and embracing him, as if the discovery belongs to the son rather than the sisters. These variations again point to multiple narrative strands, each emphasizing a different relationship around the fallen god. The texts also preserve a strong sense that Osiris is not simply gone and finished. Sometimes he is described as enduring, rising, being lifted up, refusing decay. In such passages, the language drifts toward the imagery of sleep rather than death, as if death is being softened into a reversible condition. Yet the mention of corruption and decay suggests the opposite, that death is present, but spoken of indirectly. The idea may be that Osiris crosses into another mode of life, revived in a transformed state, not as an ordinary living being, but as a figure who continues beyond death and becomes central to what follows. Alongside the tradition of Osiris being attacked and cast down, another version appears: Osiris as a figure connected to drowning. A small cluster of lines treats his fate as tied to water, as if he was lost in a flood or submerged in a place that becomes part of his story. Later, Egyptian beliefs sometimes view drowning as a special kind of death with sacred implications, and rituals connected to Osiris make heavy use of water symbolism. In that setting, Seth can appear not only as attacker but as a participant in rites that involve carrying or moving Osiris through a water-based ceremony. This opens the possibility that, in some circles, Seth was thought of as having caused Osiris's drowning, or at least as being linked to it in a way that was ritually meaningful. The coexistence of these traditions, Osiris struck down on land and Osiris drowned in water, shows again how Egyptian mythology could hold different explanations without forcing them into a single tidy account. In the end, the texts also speak of triumph. After struggle and upheaval, Horus is portrayed as crushing Seth and forcing him into submission. Seth is brought low, not merely defeated in a moment, but reduced in status and made to bow under a higher authority. In these victory scenes, Thoth often appears as an organizer and ally, helping drive back Seth's followers and gather them as a routed group. The conflict expands beyond two rivals into camps and supporters, a broader war rather than a single duel. The language of defeat emphasizes disorder being pushed back, a hostile force broken and delivered under control. In some passages, the victory is described in terms that center Osiris, as though the outcome restores not only Horus's honor, but Osiris's rightful order as well. And the defeat of Seth becomes part of a larger restoration of balance. After the fighting and the shocks that rippled through the mythic world, the story seems to move into a different kind of arena. Not a battlefield, but a court. In this version of events, Seth is no longer simply a rival god acting in the wild. He is treated like an offender summoned to face judgment. The setting is imagined as a sacred center where the gods assemble, with Gabe placed in the role of presiding authority. The scene is tense, almost theatrical. Heaven is described as unsettled and the earth as trembling, as if the entire cosmos reacts to the moment when violence is brought into the light and turned into a legal question. Horus arrives, Thoth appears, and Osiris is raised up from the posture of defeat and made to stand before the gathered divine powers, as though the victim must be present for the case to have weight. The accusation is not vague. Seth is confronted over what he did to Osiris. and he is forced to answer for it in a formal way, in a hall that functions like a divine court. In this telling, Seth does what many defendants do. He tries to reframe the story. He claims the act was not committed in the way others describe it, and he suggests motives that would lessen his guilt. He implies he was challenged. He hints that the conflict was mutual. He tries to transform an assault into a contest, an ambush into a rivalry. But the tone of the scene suggests the gods are not easily persuaded. The threats spoken against him carry the feeling of a verdict, already leaning in one direction. The atmosphere is not one of open debate so much as a reckoning that has been delayed but cannot be avoided. One striking feature of this courtroom version is that Horus does not dominate it. The roles appear inverted compared to the more familiar feud. Instead of Horus being the main plaintiff, the dispute is framed as Osiris versus Seth, with Horus and Thoth acting more like supporters and enforcers than the central voices. The consequence, as the story is hinted to unfold, is enormous. Osiris is not merely compensated, but elevated, granted a kind of vast dominion that reaches across sky and earth. In other words, the trial is not only about punishment, it is also about the restoration of cosmic hierarchy. The judgment becomes a way of declaring who truly holds legitimate power after disorder. Yet the tradition does not remain consistent. Other fragments suggest that the same sacred setting hosted a different dispute, one that focused less on Osiris's fall and more on Horus's stolen eye. In that alternative emphasis, the heart of the legal act is the return of the eye to Horus, almost as if the court's main function is to restore what was seized and to confirm the right of the injured party. Geb still appears as the authority figure, but the charge against Seth is not laid out with the same clarity. What stands out is the moment of restitution, as though the court's most visible decision is the act of giving back what was taken. An additional layer makes the scene even more complex. In some passages, the king is linked unusually closely with Horus, as if the living ruler is being presented not only as a follower of Horus, but as Horus's active presence on earth. The court is still chaired by Geb, but now the decision is heard by a principle of truth and balance rather than by a simple council. The language paints a legal drama that resembles a human inheritance dispute, except expanded into divine scale. Horus is portrayed as an heir claiming what belongs to him. The case becomes less about raw violence and more about rightful succession. The conflict turns into an argument over who inherits authority after a death, who has the legal right to the estate of the fallen figure and who is trying to seize it illegitimately. This inheritance angle gives the story a sharper social realism. It is no longer just gods clashing in mythic chaos. It resembles a court case between relatives, where the weaker party is described as an orphaned figure forced to argue against a stronger opponent. The court's conclusion in this framing is a transfer of power. The seats and thrones connected to Geb's authority are assigned to Horus, and the result is expressed as a formal ruling. The point is not only that Horus wins, the point is that Horus is declared justified. Victory is turned into legitimacy, and legitimacy is turned into governance. After the judgment, the story moves toward punishment, but the punishment is unusual. It is not described primarily as an execution or a final annihilation. Instead, Seth is forced into a humiliating role, carrying Osiris. The image is both physical and symbolic. The enemy who tried to throw Osiris down must now bear him. The aggressor becomes the support. The one who tried to overturn order must now uphold it. The language emphasizes restraint and control. Seth is placed beneath Osiris, so that he cannot throw him off again, cannot escape the weight, cannot break free from the new hierarchy. The punishment is framed as retribution, but it is also framed as a reversal that repairs the original crime by turning its direction backward. Sometimes this carrying appears to connect with ritual action, especially rites that involve water and motion. The punishment then begins to look like something acted out, not only narrated. Seth becomes tied to a ceremonial role in which a figure representing Osiris is borne along, as though the myth is being used to explain and empower ritual performance. In at least one telling, Seth is linked to storm imagery, and a rule is imposed on him even while he carries the restored figure, as if the one associated with disorder must be kept from polluting the act of restoration. The scene is difficult, shifting in meaning depending on how it is read, but the underlying idea remains stable. Seth's strength is not erased. It is harnessed and constrained, forced into service. And then, surprisingly, the tone can soften. After Seth has paid in this humiliating way, some passages treat him with far more generosity than the earlier accusations would suggest. He is shown cooperating with Horus rather than opposing him, sometimes acting in tandem for the benefit of the deceased king. The two former rivals are pictured defending the king together, fighting off threats, providing ladders or means of ascent to heaven, even being spoken of as embodied within the king's own being. Seth is sometimes placed in a structured divine household, given a consort, folded into the system rather than cast out of it. This is not presented as a neat moral ending, and it is rarely attached directly to the courtroom drama as an explicit "and therefore." Instead, it feels like another strand placed beside the others. A tradition in which Seth's dangerous force is acknowledged, but also made useful when properly controlled. In that strand, the myth does not end with permanent exile. It ends with a kind of tense reintegration, a reminder that Egyptian myth often prefers balance and containment over total destruction. A god associated with violence can still have a role if that role strengthens the order the universe depends on. All these versions placed together reveal how composite the story really is. Even the family relationships do not stay fixed. In one framework, Horus and Seth appear as equal rivals and near peers, almost like brothers. In another, Seth becomes the uncle figure standing against a younger heir, because the feud is now tied to Osiris's death and to inheritance. The Horus in these traditions is not always the same kind of figure either. Sometimes he is a powerful adult god capable of brutal retaliation. Sometimes he is recast into the role of a child who must grow into vengeance and kingship. That shift is not a small detail. It shows that the myth is not a single original tale retold consistently. It is a fusion of at least two major storylines, adjusted again and again so that separate divine traditions could be tied together. The seams of that fusion can still be sensed. In certain scenes, roles that might once have belonged to other gods appear to migrate toward Horus over time, especially as the Osiris story becomes dominant, and Horus is made the champion who saves his father. At the same time, other gods continue to share in actions that later audiences might expect Horus to perform alone. Thoth often remains central in the capture and control of Seth. The Divine Council participates. Geb is repeatedly present, sometimes as judge, sometimes as enforcer, sometimes as a father figure within the family network. The myth does not assign one single hero consistent control over every scene. Instead, it distributes authority, which is exactly what would be expected in a tradition formed out of overlapping cults, regions, and rituals. The result is a myth that behaves like a living archive rather than a single narrative. A courtroom drama exists beside a feud over a stolen eye. A revenge story exists beside an inheritance dispute. A humiliating punishment exists beside moments of cooperation and reconciliation. Even the identity of Horus shifts as the story is adapted to new theological needs. Over time, the Osiris framework seems to absorb older rival traditions and reshape them, turning a cosmic struggle between peers into a family tragedy and a legal restoration of rightful rule. And yet the older echoes do not vanish. They remain embedded as alternative memories of the same conflict, preserved side by side, allowing the story to serve multiple purposes. Explaining disorder, justifying kingship, grounding ritual, and showing how balance can be recovered even after violence threatens to undo the world. The Horus who fought with Seth gradually came to be seen as the model for the living king. This link does not appear in a perfectly tidy way in the earliest funerary writings, yet it shows up again and again and helps explain why Horus and Osiris become so closely connected in ritual. Once the dead king started to be treated as Osiris, the living ruler could be cast as Horus in a very practical sense. The son who protects, restores, and completes what death has interrupted. That shift changes how older stories are used. Scenes that originally belonged to one feud begin to serve the other, and the same set of actions can be read in two different directions, depending on whether the focus is on the living ruler's authority or the dead ruler's transformation. A striking example appears in a group of ceremonies centered on water. In these rites, Osiris, or the dead king in Osiris's role, is carried through water as if taking part in a final journey. One detail has often been treated as puzzling. Seth seems to appear beneath Osiris, as though he were a creature or support meant to be carried along with him. It has sometimes been described as if Seth was simply a mount for Osiris. But in the world of the Old Kingdom, riding animals does not fit the normal picture, and the scene makes far more sense when read as a funerary voyage. Seth's part can be understood as the vessel itself, the thing that bears the dead god across the waters. Later, dramatic material makes this interpretation clearer, showing that the form behind the image is not a strange physical stunt, but the idea of transport, passage, and forced service. Seth is made to carry what he opposed, and the journey becomes a ritual statement of control. Unlike Horus, Seth is not given multiple family lines. He is presented as the child of the earth god and the sky goddess, and as the brother of Osiris. Yet another tradition occasionally calls him the brother of Horus, and that small contradiction matters because it reveals how flexible these figures could be. Seth is also counted among the main divine family, associated with the great sacred genealogy, appearing alongside the creator and the first gods, and with Isis, Nephthys, and Osiris. His character is not painted with a single brush. He is often the enemy, violent and disruptive, but at other times he appears joined with Horus in the person of the king, or even acting in ways that benefit royal power. This is not necessarily the result of merging two separate gods into one. It may reflect a real change in how Seth was viewed as politics shifted, since divine reputations could rise or fall with earthly fortunes. Even so, across both major story cycles, he remains the chief opponent, and that creates the central problem. Why does the same figure serve as the villain in two myths that seem to have different beginnings? One influential explanation argues that the feud between Horus and Seth came first. In that view, the Osiris cult expanded later, and as it spread, Seth was drawn into hostility against Osiris as well. Horus then becomes not only Seth's ancient rival, but also the son who avenges Osiris. In many passages, it is not always obvious whether Horus is the older local champion fighting for rule, or the son of Isis acting within the Osiris drama. The suggestion is that an older struggle about power over Egypt was transferred into the Osiris story, and then given a new cause. Instead of rivalry between two claimants, the conflict is explained through the murder of Osiris, and the old trial becomes a legal case framed as vengeance and restoration. The judgment is placed in the hands of the gods at the great sacred court, turning political rivalry into a cosmic lawsuit. A close reading of the earliest funerary writings supports much of this. The trial scene appears in two forms. One, where Horus and Seth argue before a tribunal, and another, where Osiris and Seth do. The Osiris-centered version can look smoother and more complete, but it also reads like a reworked copy of the older dispute. Even a royal title that later becomes closely tied to Osiris seems to have belonged first to Horus, and to the living king's legitimacy, only afterward being transferred to the dead god. In the earliest stage, Horus is not automatically linked to Isis or to Osiris. That connection is something that develops as different traditions are made to serve a single royal theology. When the frequency of these themes is compared across the pyramids, patterns appear. Mentions of the Horus-Seth quarrel without Osiris show up slightly more often in the earlier pyramids than in later ones, though the difference is not enormous. References that involve Osiris and Seth, especially those where Horus also appears and older elements are clearly being pulled into an Osirian setting, become more common as time goes on. If attention is limited to places where Seth is named directly, he is more often paired with Horus than with Osiris, but his hostility toward Osiris is more consistently harsh. Some passages describe Seth being punished by being forced to carry Osiris, and these texts gradually move closer to the burial focus within the tomb. At first they are absent, then they appear but are placed in less prominent spaces, and later they are brought as near as possible to the sarcophagus chamber, often positioned where ritual emphasis is strongest. That shift suggests growing Osirian influence and a stronger desire to anchor the king's fate in the Osiris framework. Disagreements among scholars largely come down to how the categories are drawn. If the Osiris-Seth feud is counted only when Horus is absent, the Horus-Seth material can seem dominant. But if the Osiris drama is allowed to include the common pattern where Horus appears as the avenger and helper, then the Osiris-centered cycle becomes the stronger presence overall. Even in the earliest pyramids, there are multiple signs of Osiris-related conflict, though they may not always be counted if the dead king's identification with Osiris is treated as a separate issue. Taken together, the evidence points to a clear sequence. The Horus conflict is older, and the Osiris story grows into it, absorbing it and giving it new meaning. The placement of spells on the walls adds another layer. These texts were not random. Their locations mattered, and the most important space was the sarcophagus chamber, where the burial climax was imagined to take place. In the earliest pyramid inscriptions, the most prominent Horus-centered spell is given a commanding position in that chamber. Yet, it disappears from later royal pyramids and is only rarely echoed in later funerary tradition. Other non-Osirian spells connected with the conflict show a steady decline in status over time, being moved from central walls to less significant rooms and corridors. Meanwhile, texts that place the conflict firmly inside an Osirian setting keep their prestigious positions, remaining near the heart of the tomb in later pyramids. That gradual rearrangement matches the broader development. What began as a Horus story is steadily pulled into an Osiris narrative until the two can hardly be separated. The structure of the myths supports the same conclusion. The Horus-Seth conflict is simpler in form, while the Osiris version is more elaborate. In myth-making, simpler patterns tend to be earlier, while complexity often grows as stories merge and serve new purposes. Contradictions also multiply when two traditions are forced to share the same characters. Horus is the clearest example. Once he is both the living king and the son who avenges Osiris, older scenes have to be reinterpreted. Actions that once affirmed royal victory now become acts of filial devotion. The famous recovered eye, once a symbol of triumph over an enemy, becomes an offering presented to the dead god. The enemy of Horus becomes the enemy of Osiris, not because the stories began that way, but because a new royal theology required that alignment. The driving force behind the fusion is the pairing of two identifications: the living king with Horus and the dead king with Osiris. The first likely has deeper roots in political reality. Horus appears as the tutelary power of the group that established dominance, and the king's authority is reflected in Horus's victory and rightful rule. Osiris's rise to prominence in the funerary sphere seems to have different causes. Even in the earliest texts, Osiris sometimes appears in roles that do not simply mirror the dead king. He can be a power feared by the dead, a figure who holds a kind of jurisdiction over them. A god who rescues the king is praised for not handing him over to Osiris, suggesting that Osiris could be imagined as a dangerous master of the underworld, not merely a friendly model for resurrection. This darker edge hints at why Osiris could become central to the question of what happens after death, and why the dead king's fate could be bound to him so tightly. There are also traces of an older idea in which the dead king might once have been linked to Horus as well, not only to Osiris. At one stage, the king could even be described as incorporating both Horus and Seth together, especially in protective spells aimed at warding off serpents and other threats. That picture is very different from the later story where Seth is the murderer of Osiris. Seth's occasional role as part of royal power does not naturally lead to the idea that the living king slays his predecessor. The dominant royal posture is not that of an enemy, but of a loyal successor who honours the dead. And royal ritual emphasises continuity with ancestors, rather than violent rupture. Seth's enmity toward Osiris is therefore better explained as an extension of his original opposition to Horus. Once Horus is cast as the son of the dead king within an Osiris framework, the older hostility is redirected. The ancient rival becomes the killer, the opponent of kingship becomes the opponent of resurrection, and the conflict that once settled supremacy is transformed into a drama of death, restoration, and rightful order. Looking closely at how the gods are placed around the king helps reveal how two different story traditions slowly moved toward each other. In many early spells, the dead ruler is not treated as an Osiris figure at all. Instead, Horus and Seth stand nearest to him, sometimes so close that they seem to merge with him. In the beginning, that makes sense. There is no obvious reason why a dead king should be imagined in a completely different divine role from a living king. In some passages, the king is not tied tightly to any single god. A spell may list a whole circle of divine powers as guardians, yet the same list can also imply danger, as if those very beings could turn hostile. Even where Horus appears as a spokesman at the opening of such a text, the rest of the spell may treat him less as the king's identity and more as one voice among many, acting around the king rather than being the king. Across the pyramid texts, the relationship between Horus, Seth, Osiris, and the king is not stable. It shifts in steps, and those steps show a gradual reshaping of royal theology. At the earliest stage, Horus and Seth can be presented as the king himself, while Osiris, even if named, does not yet carry an unmistakably royal meaning. In that early picture, the king speaks to the creator god and is told to face Horus and Seth as if they are two presences within the royal sphere. The scene imagines injuries being bound up and violence being restrained, as though an older conflict is being controlled inside the king's person. Yet the text already carries hints of later influence. Osiris can appear as the father of Horus, even when other lines suggest a different divine father. This is the first sign that an older Horus tradition is being nudged toward an Osiris framework, not cleanly replaced, but quietly adjusted. A second stage takes shape when the king is equipped with divine identities that are already coloured by Osirian themes, even if Osiris himself is not named. The king can be clothed in the power of a great magician god, linked with a southern sacred centre, and then identified with a particular Horus form that is no longer purely tribal or local in feel. The Horus figure begins to look like the son of Isis, which means the older feud story has started to drift toward the family drama that will later dominate. The king is still not Osiris, but Horus is no longer just the ancient rival of Seth. He is being reshaped into a son with a mother, and that change will eventually pull Osiris onto the stage as the father. A third stage appears when the king is imagined as a dual presence rather than a single god name. Doors open in different sacred places for Horus and for Seth, and the king's own movements and speech are mirrored by them, as if two forces are operating through one royal body. Difficulties faced by one side can be overcome by the strength of the other. This idea is not always handled consistently, because the same short spell can also compare the king to the creator god, showing how freely these texts shift images. But the overall impression is clear. Horus and Seth are still very close to the king, yet the relationship is beginning to feel less like simple identification and more like partnership. From there, the texts often move into a fourth pattern, where Horus and Seth remain closely bound to the king, but the bond no longer fully turns them into him. They act as helpers, lifting the king's arm, guiding him toward the next realm, giving him ritual substances, or clearing away danger tied to specific days in the burial sequence. Horus removes harm that clings to the king. Seth cancels what was done against him. In some versions of these ideas, Osiris is mentioned more strongly, and the king is addressed in a way that links him to Osiris. Yet the spell can still end by placing the king among eternal stars, or among followers of Osiris, rather than making him Osiris outright. Other lines can describe the king's right and left sides, as if Horus and Seth stand on them, or even as if those sides are Horus and Seth, in a more literal sense. In another spell, Horus is said to carry the king while Seth raises him, and the wording makes Horus look like the living king who comes to visit and see his father in a new form. That language points to a very old idea. Horus belongs primarily to the living ruler, the active successor, the one who approaches, speaks, and restores order. Seth, even when dangerous elsewhere, can still appear here as a force that strengthens royal might. Some spells of this type actually preserve more than one layer at once, combining older double identification with newer hints of Osiris. Then a major turn becomes visible. The dead king begins to be treated openly as Osiris, and Horus and Seth are portrayed as cooperating for his benefit. The dead ruler is told to rise, promised water, flood, and milk from Isis, and described as the father who brought Horus into being. Yet Seth is not automatically condemned in this stage. The dead king can be urged to rise like Seth, implying that Seth's strength and vigour can still serve the royal dead. Elsewhere, the Osiris king is pictured travelling to heaven, crossing a lake, taking a place in the northern sky, and being summoned as a guardian. In one version, Horus speaks with him. In another version, Seth fills that role. Even the ladder to heaven, a strongly solar image, is tied in front of Osiris, and Horus is described as lifting it for his father. Here, older solar ascent ideas are not discarded. They are redirected so that Osiris becomes the one who benefits from them. In a similar way, a spell can depict the king moving through places linked, with both Horus and Seth, while cosmic powers guide him out from the great sacred center. Horus spreads a protective covering over him. Seth lays out shelter for him. The king is constantly made parallel to Osiris, and yet both rival gods are still pictured as contributors to his passage and protection. Only in the next phase does the fusion become complete and harsh. The dead king is not merely like Osiris, he is Osiris, and Seth is cast as the enemy and killer. Horus now becomes the avenger in explicit terms. The son is shown striking the one who struck his father, slaughtering the one who slaughtered him, binding the one who bound him, forcing the enemy under a female figure who represents a final containment of violence. In another spell, Seth's assault on Osiris is described directly. Yet the same text can suddenly return to showing Seth in a constructive role connected with the heavenly ladder. The result is a layered, sometimes illogical mixture. Old images of Horus and Seth working together survive inside a newer narrative where Seth must be condemned as the murderer. Other passages show Horus seizing Seth and placing him under the Osiris king, or delivering him bowed down and helpless. At this point, the older rivalry between Horus and Seth is still visible, but it has been recruited into the Osiris drama and made to explain Osiris's death and Horus's duty. Two broad facts support this sequence. The first is that the Horus conflict stands on its own and shows signs of being earlier. It can exist without Osiris, while the later Osiris-centered feud often seems to borrow the structure of the older quarrel and place it into a new family story. The second is that references to Osiris become far more frequent as time goes on, which matches the wider spread of Osiris worship in the late Old Kingdom. The texts do not change overnight, but their balance shifts. Osiris becomes more present, more central, and more tightly connected to the dead king's fate. In the stage development described above, the first clear step toward fusion appears when the dead king begins to be identified with Osiris, while Horus and Seth still operate as his helpers. Full fusion arrives only when Seth is firmly fixed as the Slayer and Horus as the Avenger Son. In that completed form, Osiris enters the story above all as the dead father, and Horus's role is reshaped around that relationship. Earlier, Horus could be the king in life and in death, sometimes even paired with Seth as a double royal power. Later, once the dead king becomes Osiris, Horus is redefined as the living heir, and Seth becomes the necessary enemy of both. The final question is why Osiris is chosen for the dead king, but not for the living one. The most likely answer lies in what Osiris originally represented. Osiris already belonged to the realm of the dead. By becoming Osiris, the deceased ruler could claim authority in that feared and powerful domain. The dead king is placed on Osiris's throne not simply to imitate a myth, but to acquire sovereignty over the underworld itself. In that sense, the fusion is not just a literary blending of tales. It is a political and ritual solution. The living king rules on Earth in a Horus role, while the dead king rules beyond death in an Osiris role. Once those two identifications are set side by side, the older Horus-Seth rivalry and the newer Osiris drama are pulled together until they form a single, tightly interlocked story of kingship, death, and restoration. From this point, the wounded eye of Horus becomes one of the most powerful symbols in the entire tradition. Later, funerary texts imagine a dead person asking for a boat and being challenged to name each of its parts, because knowing the name of a thing means having power over it. Among those parts appears a humble tool used to scoop water, yet its true name is given as a vivid image. It is the hand of Isis, wiping blood from Horus's injured eye. A small detail like that carries a huge weight. It shows how the eye story travelled far beyond one myth. It appears in dramatic religious compositions and returns constantly in offering spells. Sometimes the eye is treated as the chief victim of the conflict, sometimes as the offering itself, and sometimes as a precious ornament whose redness becomes a memory of violence. In rare lines, the object offered can even be framed as a reminder of Seth's rage. But far more often, the restored eye stands for wholeness, authority, and favour. In many dramatic versions of the story, the eye is returned to Horus, not to Osiris. That detail matters because it likely preserves the older meaning. Horus represents the living ruler, and restoring the eye to him signals the completion of kingship. Yet, in the pyramid texts, the eye is often said to be presented to Osiris, which creates a tension. How can the eye be restored to someone who is not its owner? Later tradition tries to smooth this by speaking as though Horus is somehow present within the Osiris king, making the gift to Osiris also a gift to Horus. The language is a workaround, a sign that the older symbol has been pushed into a new theological framework. A classic account of the injury describes the day of conflict between the two rivals. Horus fights Seth, Horus's face is wounded, and Horus seizes Seth in return. The passage credits Thoth with resolving the crisis with his fingers, and that phrase has been understood as a healing action. It may also hint at ensuring completeness, as if Thoth guarantees that what was damaged is made whole again. The deeper point is that the eye is filled and restored. The story is not simply about harm, but about repair, and the divine healer is the one who brings the damaged power back into balance. Other versions push the tale into more colourful directions. One account explains why a sacred northern town is given to Horus as compensation, and links the episode to the origin of an animal's name and to the later impurity of pigs in Horus's cult. In this telling, Horus is invited to look at his eye and notices its bright whiteness. Then, he is told to look again, this time at a black pig. The sight triggers pain, the eye flares with suffering, and Horus collapses. The explanation follows. Seth had taken the form of that pig and struck Horus's eye. The gods then agree that the pig is hateful to Horus, and the animal becomes taboo in that religious context. Yet the story bears the marks of later explanation rather than early foundation. The link between Seth and the pig cannot be firmly placed in the Old Kingdom, and pigs may have been excluded from offerings for more practical reasons, long before a Sethian connection was emphasized. Familiarity, domestic usefulness, and changing ritual habits could all shape the animal's status. The tale reads like a myth designed to explain an existing taboo, not necessarily the source of it. The injured eye also moves out of temple and tomb into the world of healing. Medical spells often identify the sick person with Horus, because the patient's struggle against disease mirrors Horus's struggle against Seth. If Horus's eye can be rescued, then the patient's body can be rescued too. In such texts, the eye is invoked as a protective power, and the healer speaks as if standing in Thoth's role, acting as the physician who treats the divine wound. The language calls upon the victorious eye to drive out enemies of every kind, living and dead, male and female, who are imagined as forces invading the sufferer's eyes. Even the tools used to measure remedies can be linked symbolically to the measures used in treating Horus's eye, as if the act of accurate preparation echoes the divine restoration of wholeness. In this way, the myth becomes a working model for cure, a pattern of injury, intervention, and recovery that can be repeated whenever the body falters. In one of the most theatrical moments from the Ramesseum dramatic tradition, Seth's injuries are not shown in a literal way at all. Instead, they appear as two scepters, objects of authority, not anatomy, while Horus, or sometimes the king standing in Horus's role, is pictured taking in the power those scepters represent. The scene feels deliberate. A private wound is turned into a public symbol. And it is hard not to notice the extra layer this invites. Two scepters can easily suggest a paired sovereignty, the old idea of a country divided into two lands that must be held together under one rule. In that sense, the violence is not only punishment, it becomes a transfer of legitimacy. The same kind of thinking lies behind another famous symbol. The eye of Horus is constantly treated not just as an organ that was injured and healed, but as an emblem of kingship, even as a crown in its own right. In these stories, bodily damage becomes political language. Other scenes in the same dramatic cycle speak about Seth losing a leg, as if a second mutilation has been added to the myth. Some scholars treated this as another blow dealt during his final defeat. But the details fit better with something else that Egyptian ritual returns to again and again. The slaughter of the bull. Seth is repeatedly tied to the bull sacrifice tradition. Many texts describe him being killed in the form of a bull, and the rites of funerary religion use that association so often that it begins to feel almost standard. When the papyrus talks about tearing out a leg, it can be read less as a strange new mythic wound and more as the imagery of butchery that has been absorbed into the story world of the gods. The myth does not remain a single clean narrative. It becomes a stage where several ritual languages, legal contest, royal inheritance, sacrifice, speak at the same time. A later funerary spell tradition even goes further and frames Horus's victory as something guaranteed by divine decree. The god's words will overturn Seth. Osiris is portrayed, giving Horus a feather as a visible sign of triumph, something to be fixed on the head as a reward for overcoming enemies. The same passage then describes Seth's testicles being removed for Horus, an image that is both graphic and symbolic. Castration in such a context is not random cruelty. It reads as a way of stripping an opponent of power, ending his claim to rule, and turning his strength into a trophy for the victor. The myth keeps returning to the same message. Sovereignty is a force that can be lost, seized, displayed, and ritually confirmed. Once these two injuries, the eye and the testicles, become fixed in the tradition, they attract a remarkable amount of interpretation. Medical and magical texts, especially, love detail. A spell meant for loosening bandages, for example, retells the healing of Horus by Isis, and then turns that story into a request for the patient's release from harm. The logic is simple and effective. Just as Horus was freed from the evil done by Seth, so the sufferer demands freedom from sickness, blood, dangerous forces, hostile dead, and unseen adversaries. The myth becomes a legal precedent that can be invoked. The words do not merely remind, they compel. If a god was once released, the human speaker insists the same release must happen again. Some traditions even claim that Seth too was healed after the dispute was brought before the divine hall. In that version, the argument is settled, the wounds are dealt with, and Seth recovers his strength like someone restored to ordinary life. Other spells mention the exact place where Isis cried out and where Seth's testicles were cut off, as if the ritual imagination is trying to pin a mythical moment to a physical room. Another kind of text goes in a darker direction and threatens the gods themselves. Obedience is demanded, and restoration is made conditional. If the gods refuse, the eye will not be returned to Horus, and the testicles will not be returned to Seth. In this tradition, the missing parts become bargaining chips. The myth is no longer only about what happened long ago. It becomes a weapon in the hands of the magician who claims authority through speech. That same magical world can also flip the roles in surprising ways. In some spells, Seth helps the magician fight disease, as if his violent strength can be borrowed for a good purpose. Illness is treated like a hostile being that can be threatened, pushed back, even trampled. Speaker may declare, "I am Seth," and use that identity to crush the enemy. In another ritual, aimed at controlling a lamp for divination, power is achieved through intimidation. The lamp is refused oil and fat, and then threatened with grotesque offerings and with contact to the enemy of Horus, specifically to the wounded part that symbolizes Seth's defeat. It is deliberately unsettling because the point is control. The lamp, like the disease, is forced to obey by fear. There are also moments where the myth has been absorbed into everyday domestic magic in ways that feel almost playful. A charm meant to stop a child from nursing can speak of swallowing as Horus and chewing as Seth, as if the two rivals have been miniaturized into a household metaphor. That is a long way from royal ritual. It shows how a concept once tied to kingship, one body containing two divine forces, could spread downward into popular speech. Yet the same tradition can also keep Seth on the other side, aligned with poisons and snakes, surrounded by confederates who must be driven away. Over time, both tendencies grow, Seth as a useful force in certain spells, and Seth as a target of attack in others. The myth's symbols become almost proverb-like. To say that Horus is satisfied with his eye and Seth is satisfied with his testicles becomes a general way of describing reconciliation, completion, and a restored balance. At this point, a practical question arises. Are these mutilations imagined as happening in animal form or human form? Horus is often described as a falcon, but even that is not as straightforward as it looks. The exact species has been debated, and the texts do not require the audience to care. Horus means the one on high, and the falcon is the obvious sign for that. Seth is even more complicated. The famous Seth creature has been explained as various animals across the history of interpretation, and no single identification solves everything. A fight between a falcon and a dog-like desert animal could be imagined as a biological event, but the actual myths rarely describe it that way. Most of the time, the conflict is framed as a clash between persons. There are a few lines that seem to lean toward animal imagery. Seth trampling the eye, eating it, holding it in his mouth so it becomes blood red. But the dominant picture is anthropomorphic. The gods argue like rivals for a throne. Seth has followers. Horus appeals for the return of what was stolen. The conflict turns into a lawsuit before a tribunal, a setting that belongs to politics and law more than to nature. Thoth, whose animal form is usually an ibis, is described as losing an arm in the fight or treating the injured eye with his fingers. In the story world, the gods can wear animal signs and still behave like men. The falcon identity of Horus does not push the myth into the biology of hawks. Instead, the royal identity pushes the myth into the logic of human power. That shift makes sense once the social background is kept in view. The earliest society that carried these stories seems to have been made up of rival groups, each with its own god shown on a standard. The leader of a group did not merely worship the god. He embodied the god's force in a political and ritual sense. That is why a myth that begins with a falcon god can quickly turn into a narrative about kingship, inheritance, domination, and legal judgment. The animal sign remains, but the struggle becomes a human struggle because the ruler is the living interface between God and community. In that setting, castration is not just cruelty. It is a clear mythic way to say, this rival has been stripped of rule. This is why the idea that Horus and Seth are simply cosmic symbols of conflict, eternally fighting to maintain a timeless equilibrium, misses something essential. Egyptian mythology certainly contains great cosmic battles, especially those linked to the sun's journey and the threat of chaos. But the Horus-Seth feud carries the marks of a political origin. Rival claims, judgment, inheritance, the problem of who rules the two lands. Later texts do treat it proverbially, and later religion does smooth it into a kind of balanced duality inside kingship. Yet the earliest shape is difficult to explain without social struggle in the background. That same background also explains why other gods appear on early standards, without needing to be reduced to literal animals owned by the king. Some modern readings try to treat certain standard bearers as royal hunting dogs, or emblems of royal possession, but the evidence points more strongly to independent divine figures with their own cults. What brought them into alliance with Horus, and what allowed Seth at times to be fused with Horus inside the king, was political reality, alliance, conquest, and the need to express unity after conflict. Even the symbolism of the two eyes of Horus reflects how layered the tradition becomes. Only one eye is supposed to be injured by Seth, while the other remains sound and is sometimes called the sound eye. Yet texts can also suggest that the sound eye once left Horus and had to be returned, which blurs the distinction. Sometimes sound looks like a title for the healed eye rather than for the untouched one. The tradition is not always consistent because the same symbol is being used for several purposes at once: wholeness, royal power, cosmic order, and ritual offering. Then the myth takes a turn into episodes that are more shocking and more openly humiliating. Later, texts preserve a story in which Seth violates Horus sexually. Traces of this have sometimes been read back into earlier passages, especially texts that say Seth was made to carry Osiris or was set beneath the Osiris king. But those earlier lines fit much more naturally into the carrying tradition, where Seth functions as the bearer in a funerary journey. The explicit sexual episode is better documented later, and one of the earliest long versions presents Horus as still young. Seth praises him in obscene language. Horus reports the threat to Isis, and Isis gives her son instructions to protect himself through trickery. She uses magical knowledge, not physical force. The goal is to prevent Seth from gaining dominance over Horus, and to turn the attempt into Seth's shame. In the better-known literary version of the dispute, Horus is no longer simply a child, but Isis still plays the role of strategic ally. The story becomes a contest of deception. Seth boasts of what he has done, but the tribunal demands proof, and the seed is summoned. Seth's claim collapses because the seed that should confirm his dominance is called out and answers from elsewhere, while Horus's seed is summoned and appears from Seth in a dazzling sign. The myth is not presented as erotic. It is presented as a courtroom drama about status. Sexuality is used as a weapon because it is treated as dishonor for the victim. The act is framed as contamination and humiliation, like eating something filthy. It is an assault on dignity, not a celebration of desire. At the same time, the story carries another mythic thread, a tradition in which Thoth is somehow born or manifested from Seth's head or forehead. The later literary tale does not simply identify the shining emergence with Thoth, yet it clearly plays in the same mythic field. Other funerary texts speak of Thoth as the judge between the two brothers, and describe him as coming forth in a strange way, tied to their conflict. This is one reason the episode cannot be reduced to a simple victor humiliates vanquished explanation. Seth is not the ultimate victor in the Horus cycle. Yet, he is the one who attempts the violation. The act is not proof of dominance so much as proof of hostility and moral pollution. It also serves a narrative purpose. It creates a dramatic reversal where Seth tries to disgrace Horus, and Horus, aided by Isis and Thoth, turns the disgrace back onto Seth. Magical texts show how widely this theme spread. Some spells speak bluntly about Seth's seed being in Horus's belly and command it to turn back, undoing what was done against a named victim. Temple inscriptions from later periods even ritualize the punishment in symbolic offerings. Lettuces, associated with fertility because of their milky sap, are offered with words that ask for the enemy to become pregnant and for a son to emerge from the forehead. The language is explicit in its aim, to force the enemy into a humiliating reversal, to make him carry what he tried to impose. Here, the myth is not just remembered, it is used as a model for coercion, for turning an aggressor's power against him. As these stories expand, Seth's hostility is also redirected toward the young Horus, born to Isis. The feud is no longer only a rivalry between two established gods. It becomes an attack by an older, aggressive figure on a vulnerable heir. Isis becomes the primary defender, using magic to ward off dangers that now look like threats against a child. This shift is one of the clearest effects of blending Horus tradition with Osiris tradition. Once Horus is defined as the son of Isis and the heir of Osiris, Seth's hostility spreads naturally to the child, and Isis must become the protective mother of myth. Other episodes grow around this protective cycle. One tradition tells of Horus and Seth fighting or playing in the river as hippopotami, with Isis intervening. Horus, furious that his mother shows any concern for Seth, commits an act of violence against her, and the story then explains how Isis can be restored with a cow's head, linking Isis and Hathor in later religious thinking. Another narrative describes a contest by ships. Seth insists the boats be made of stone. Horus cheats by painting wood to look like stone, sinking Seth's vessel and forcing him into a hippopotamus form. Horus then tries to harpoon him, but the divine council forbids it. Hunting and harpooning hippopotami had ritual significance from very early times, so the scene draws on a deep reservoir of religious practice. Yet, it is not certain that the hippopotamus was always Seth in the oldest layers. The tradition shows how enemies can be absorbed into Seth over time, but that does not mean every early hostile beast was originally him. Some early harpooner gods are not Horus at all, and the identity of the victim can remain unnamed. Later, texts simplify. Seth becomes the obvious enemy, and older hostile figures fade into his shadow. Even the ship motif has deeper roots than it first appears. In funerary, carrying passages, Seth can function like the vessel that transports Osiris on a ritual journey. Once that idea exists, it is an easy step for later storytelling to place Seth in a ship and force Horus to meet him there in the same medium. The myth reuses what ritual already knows. The tradition becomes even stranger in some sources, where a story about Horus violating Isis replaces the decapitation episode. A stela from a Middle Kingdom context speaks openly of Horus violating his mother, and a later magical text sets the scene on the water, with Isis weeping as the act occurs. These versions are not common, but their presence shows that the mythic field around Horus and Isis was not fixed. Different regions and different genres, temple theology, narrative literature, magic, could generate alternative scandals and alternative explanations. The same is true for Horus's missing hands in one story. Cut off and thrown into the water by a curse from his mother, then restored by divine help. These are not stable biographies. They are mythic tools. One quiet detail captures how myth and ritual sometimes diverge. Seth is given a wife in the main tradition. Horus, surprisingly, often is not. Later, temple texts do describe a sacred marriage of a Horus form with Hathor, but it reads more like a cult arrangement than an unavoidable, mythic relationship. Magical texts sometimes assign Horus multiple wives, but those wives tend to be names of protective scorpion goddesses used because the magician wants extra authority when dealing with poison. These are functional marriages, not core myth. In the older imaginative world, Horus remains the heir and fighter, not the husband with a fixed household. The myth's focus stays on succession, injury, restoration, and the struggle for rule. The theme of incest between mother and son appears only briefly in the surviving material. Yet its implications are far-reaching. One fragment from the Ramesseum papyri hints that a god identified with Horus is said to have had sexual relations with his mother Isis, and to have impregnated his sister Nephthys, producing a daughter. Although this double violation has no clear parallel elsewhere, the identification of this god with Horus makes the passage significant. Horus and this deity are explicitly linked in older funerary texts, which means that the idea of Horus being united with his mother was already imaginable by the Middle Kingdom. A stela from that period confirms that such a union was not a late invention, but part of the evolving mythic landscape. Later interpretation has rightly rejected the idea that Horus borrowed this attribute from another fertility god. Instead, both figures seem to draw it from a deeper ideology of kingship. The king, as a divine being, stood outside ordinary human limits. Certain expressions in early funerary texts suggest that the king unites with a mother figure, described as a great cow. Yet the identity of this mother remains uncertain. She may represent a protective goddess, or the land itself, rather than a literal parent. At this early stage, there is no clear indication that Horus personally embodied this role. The myth was still fluid, and its meanings had not yet settled into fixed forms. Popular religious texts from later periods show how widely these stories circulated, beyond temple theology. Calendars of lucky and unlucky days, which reflect everyday religious thinking rather than elite doctrine, also preserve memories of divine conflict. In one such calendar, the day when the gods fought is marked as dangerous, a day when no action should be taken. The setting of the fight is damaged in the text, but other versions place it either near the underworld or in the great waters. Interestingly, some dramatic elements known from other accounts are missing. There is no mention of decapitation, restoration, or divine intervention. This shows that no single version of the story was authoritative. Different communities remembered different fragments, reshaping the myth according to local concerns. In other traditions, Seth attacks Horus in animal forms, using scorpions and dangerous creatures. Yet the attack rebounds. Through divine intervention, it is revealed that the aggressor himself has been harmed. The pattern is familiar. The enemy who seeks to destroy is struck by his own violence. The same reversal appears in magical texts, where the cry of pain comes not from the expected victim, but from the attacker or his offspring. Myth here serves a moral logic. Hostility carries consequences, and divine justice turns aggression back upon itself. One remarkable text describes a moment of unexpected reconciliation. Seth is bitten, stricken by pain, and Horus comes to his aid. Healing is possible, but only under strict conditions. Horus insists on knowing Seth's true name because power over a being depends on naming it correctly. Seth resists, offering grand and mysterious titles that suggest timelessness, strength, or cosmic vastness. Each time Horus rejects the answer, the name must be precise, not poetic. Eventually Seth yields and confesses a name that embodies misfortune and sterility. The moment this happens, the spell takes effect, and the wound is healed. Although the closing words compare Seth's recovery to Horus's own healing in another myth, the roles are clear. Horus is the healer. Seth is the one who must submit. The episode shows that even the enemy can be restored, but only after acknowledging his true condition. Another group of spells focuses on Isis preparing for the birth of Horus. She proclaims her pregnancy openly and calls upon the gods for protection. Horus is described as already powerful, while still unhatched, destined to inherit the land, speak for his murdered father, and destroy Seth. The language is charged with expectation. Horus is not simply a child, but a future ruler, already defined by victory. At first, the creator god questions Isis, expressing doubt about the legitimacy of the unborn child. Isis responds with confidence, insisting that the god within her is truly the seed of Osiris. Only then is the doubt removed. This hesitation is important. It reflects a recurring tension in the myth between birth and legitimacy, between divine destiny and formal recognition. When Horus finally speaks in this spell, he appears as a falcon whose wings stretch to the horizon. Yet despite this animal imagery, his actions are described in human terms. He tramples his enemy underfoot and claims distance from Seth's domain. The falcon form marks the antiquity of the tradition, but the language of domination belongs to kingship. Horus is already ruler in intention, even before the conflict is fully resolved. The story then moves toward one of its most influential episodes, the trial. This legal confrontation becomes a central element of the Horus myth, and later shapes the idea of judgment after death. The scene is usually set in a place described as the House of the Prince in Heliopolis. This location is consistently associated with authority and decision-making. In some texts, Osiris is said to have been rescued there, suggesting that the place is not only ceremonial, but also judicial. The title, Prince, likely refers to the ruling god of Heliopolis, originally the creator deity. Over time, other gods take part, but the setting remains one of cosmic law. Two female figures, known as the Two Truths, play a crucial role in this trial. They listen, command, and authorize the outcome. Their presence later becomes essential to the judgment of the dead. Although later religion treats them as guardians of moral order, their earliest appearances suggest a legal function. They hear competing claims and affirm which side is right. Rather than representing abstract ideas like life and death, they seem to embody the recognition of rival arguments. Their role in the famous dispute between Horus and Seth may explain why they later became inseparable from the judgment of all souls. From this judicial context emerges the expression commonly translated as vindicated. It first applies not to Osiris, but to Horus. The phrase originally refers to the correctness of the judgment itself, not to the moral purity of the speaker. It is the court's decision that is declared right. Horus becomes the model of the victorious litigant, the one whose claim is upheld. Only later is this status transferred to Osiris, and then to every deceased person who hopes to be justified in the afterlife. The identity of the judge in the trial varies across sources. Sometimes it is the creator god, sometimes the earth god, sometimes the collective assembly of gods. In one influential account, the earth god settles the dispute by dividing the land, assigning one region to Seth and another to Horus, and finally separating them completely. This echoes political realities and reinforces the idea that the trial is about sovereignty. As the myth develops, the sun god increasingly takes the role of supreme judge, especially when Osiris replaces Horus as the central figure of judgment. Yet the earliest layers consistently point back to the creator deity as the original authority. The question of who originally brought the case is crucial. In some texts, Osiris appears as the plaintiff, accusing Seth and receiving judgment in his favour. Yet the evidence suggests that this role was originally Horus. Horus is the one whose eye is stolen and restored. Horus is the one declared vindicated first. Osiris gradually assumes this position as funerary religion expands, and the dead king is identified with him. The trial is absorbed into the Osirian myth, but its structure remains Horian. Later funerary texts make this transition explicit. The deceased seeks vindication in the same way Horus once did. Spells ask that the dead be declared right, just as Horus was declared right against his enemy. Over time, Osiris becomes both judge and plaintiff, an arrangement that creates obvious contradictions. Some texts resolve this by assigning Horus the role of advocate, speaking on behalf of his father. Others alternate names freely, showing that the tradition no longer felt bound by strict narrative logic. Even so, the older pattern never disappears. Hymns, rituals, and temple inscriptions continue to recall Horus as the true victor, whose triumph is merely confirmed by the court. The trial does not create his victory, it ratifies it. This distinction is important. The myth presents justice not as an abstract process, but as the formal recognition of a power already demonstrated. Through all these transformations, one thread remains constant. The trial is not simply about morality, it is about legitimacy, inheritance, and order. What begins as a dispute between rival gods becomes the model for royal succession, divine justice, and ultimately the fate of every human soul. The legal drama of Horus and Seth thus stands at the foundation of Egyptian ideas about judgment, not because it teaches ethical behaviour, but because it defines how rightful authority is acknowledged and enforced in both the divine and human worlds. Over time, however, Horus was gradually displaced in this role by Osiris. The reason was straightforward. Osiris came to be identified with every deceased person. Since the dead required a victorious figure to stand in their place, Osiris naturally assumed that position. He also came to be imagined as a judge within the same judicial framework. In this way, the promise of salvation was reinforced from both sides. The dead person was identified with the one who had already triumphed, and that same figure was now imagined as presiding over the court itself. In the earliest accounts where Osiris appears as a litigant, the trial focuses on his death. Seth is accused of having caused it. The outcome grants Osiris a form of universal rule, but this sovereignty belongs primarily to the realm beyond the living world. In contrast, the trial involving Horus places sovereignty at its very centre. Horus and Seth confront each other as equals, disputing control of the land itself. This difference reflects their essential characters. Osiris belongs above all to the dead, while Horus embodies the living king and the authority exercised in the present world. The trial is therefore best understood as a lawsuit over the kingship of Egypt. Early funerary texts already hint that the two gods argued over the inheritance of the earth god, but this theme becomes fully developed in later theological narratives. In these accounts, the earth god brings the conflict to an end through formal judgment before the divine assembly. An initial verdict divides the land between the rivals. Seth receives Upper Egypt, associated with his place of origin. Horus receives Lower Egypt, linked to the place connected with his father's death. Yet this division does not last. The judge regrets having split the land and reverses the decision, granting the entire inheritance to Horus. Seth is not erased completely, but his role is reduced to a symbolic presence within the state rather than true sovereignty. Later, ritual texts, preserve this same structure. The judgment is remembered as the moment when Horus inherits his father's authority. In temple rituals, the crime of Seth is formally reported, and the judge intervenes to restore order. Horus is proclaimed the legitimate heir, receives the symbols of kingship, and is crowned ruler of the united land. Seth, by contrast, is expelled beyond Egypt's borders. Even in narrative versions filled with humour and digression, the central issue never changes. The dispute is about who holds the office once belonging to Osiris, and the conclusion always places Horus on the throne. Temple inscriptions from later periods repeat the story in elaborate detail. The divine court assembles. Justice, perception, and hearing are present alongside the creator god and his divine intellect. The suffering of Horus is reported by his mother and aunt. The judges deliberate and pronounce their decision. Horus is awarded victory, receives the title deed of kingship, and is crowned ruler of both regions of the land. He takes his seat upon the ancient throne, the same seat held by the gods at the beginning of time. These scenes are not innovations. They deliberately preserve an older theological tradition. Across all these accounts, one theme dominates. The trial is about rightful succession. Authority belongs to the legitimate son. This principle explains the myth's political power. In its earliest form, the dispute does not involve Osiris as father and Seth as uncle. Instead, Horus and Seth appear as brothers, rivals of equal standing. Such a situation naturally leads to genuine conflict and legal arbitration. Only later does the myth shift into a family drama of father, son, and murderous brother, a form that simplifies the moral structure but obscures the original political tension. The myth, therefore, provided divine sanction for patrilineal succession. Each new king could be understood as repeating the triumph of Horus. The ritual confirmation of kingship echoed the ancient judgment of the gods. It is possible that real ceremonies once reenacted this pattern, with the new ruler formally affirming his legitimacy before a divine tribunal. Even if this remains speculative, the persistence of the myth shows how deeply it shaped Egyptian political imagination. One expression repeatedly associated with the trial is the idea of the portions of Horus and Seth. At its core, this phrase refers to the division of the land. In the earliest account, these portions are the regions initially assigned to each god by the judge. Lower Egypt belongs to Horus, Upper Egypt to Seth. Later imagery shows these portions being reunited, symbolizing the restoration of unity under a single ruler. In royal art, divine figures are shown binding the two lands together, affirming that the king now holds what was once divided. In royal inscriptions, the king is described as lord of the portions of the two gods, caretaker of both regions, ruler of the entire land encircled by the sun. Sometimes Horus himself is said to possess both portions, emphasizing his final and complete victory. These statements reflect not ritual fantasy, but political reality. They mirror the ideology of unification that stood at the heart of Egyptian kingship. Occasionally, the expression is extended beyond territory to mean life, happiness, or long reign. Yet in most cases, its meaning remains geographical. The portions are Upper and Lower Egypt. Earlier scholars once suggested that the phrase referred instead to East and West, or to cultivated land and desert. Later, evidence shows that such interpretations are secondary. When desert and cultivated land are contrasted, Seth is associated with the wilderness, Horus with fertile Egypt. But this reflects later moral symbolism rather than the original sense of the division. A related expression speaks of the settlements of Horus and the settlements of Seth. In early funerary texts, these appear as regions the king will traverse in the afterlife. The phrase likely reflects ancient cult territories, rather than later administrative divisions. It points back to a time before cities and provinces dominated the landscape, when local shrines and villages formed the basic units of religious life. That such language survived in royal funerary texts shows how deeply rooted these traditions were. Other expressions reinforce the same idea, speaking of the thrones of the earth god, the cities under his authority, or the sacred waterways linked with the two rival gods. All of these terms circle around the same core concept. Sovereignty is divided, contested, judged, and finally unified. Despite the prominence of division imagery, most accounts of the trial do not actually describe a balanced settlement. The narrative usually moves directly toward the total victory of Horus. The episode of equal division appears fully only in one major theological source, and even there it is ultimately undone. Elsewhere, parity is implied only indirectly, through language that places Horus and Seth side by side. In some spells, the king is said to embody both gods at once, suggesting reconciliation rather than conflict. These variations likely reflect different historical memories or ideological needs, rather than contradictions. The myth, therefore, preserves traces of several stages. One stage reflects a world of local cults, before national unity. Another reflects a peaceful division of authority. A third reflects a unified kingdom in which former rivals are subordinated to a single ruler. The texts do not resolve these layers, they preserve them side by side. The connection between the trial of Horus and the judgment of the dead becomes clearer when examining later beliefs. Over time, Egyptians came to imagine that every person would face judgment after death. In its developed form, this judgment involved an ethical evaluation of one's life, symbolized by the weighing of the heart. This idea is most famously expressed in later funerary literature. Yet alongside it persisted another conception. The dead person feared enemies, accusations, and hostile forces. Vindication meant victory over these opponents, not simply moral purity. Many funerary spells ask for triumph against enemies in the divine council. The deceased hopes to be vindicated just as Horus once was, or as Osiris later came to be. In these texts, judgment resembles a lawsuit rather than a moral examination. The presence of adversaries is explicit. The assistance of divine advocates is sought. Seth himself is sometimes named as the enemy to be overcome. This idea also appears in private appeals written to deceased relatives. Death did not end legal conflict. The dead could still be summoned, accused, or asked for protection. Threats of posthumous litigation appear in tomb inscriptions, warning those who would damage burial places that judgment awaited them before the divine court. These beliefs reflect everyday legal practices. In life, disputes were often resolved by appealing to gods through their shrines. That same logic was extended beyond death. Over time, the ethical judgment of the individual developed alongside this older idea. In some early texts, moral innocence is already asserted. The deceased claims not to have committed wrongs, hoping for favour before the great god. Gradually, this line of thought leads to the weighing of the heart, where the heart itself becomes the accuser. The older litigation model does not disappear. Instead, it merges with ethical evaluation. The role of the moon god Thoth is central to this process. From the beginning, he is closely tied to the conflict. He heals wounds, restores balance, and assists Horus. He is sometimes portrayed as mediator, sometimes as advocate, sometimes even as judge. In later texts, he openly declares that he has judged the two rivals and ended their strife. his function expands beyond myth into general justice. He becomes the divine official who records verdicts and ensures fairness. Astral interpretations later explain his role as a cosmic harmonizer, quelling conflict in the sky as well as on Earth. Yet his political significance should not be overlooked. As mediator and reconciler, he represents the ideal of order restored through law rather than violence. Even playful or satirical versions of the myth preserve these core elements. In humorous narratives, the gods argue for decades, procedural delays pile up, and Seth is allowed to defend himself at length. Yet in the end, the verdict still favours Horus. Even when Seth is treated with sympathy or granted a role alongside the sun god, he never regains sovereignty. Across all versions, serious or comic, solemn or playful, the meaning remains consistent. The trial of Horus and Seth is not merely a myth about divine quarrels. It is a story about legitimacy, law, and power. It explains why authority belongs where it does, how order is restored after chaos, and why judgment is necessary to transform conflict into stability. In Greek and Roman literature, the struggle between Horus and Seth is rarely treated as an independent myth. Classical authors almost always absorb it into the larger story of Osiris. Writers such as Herodotus, Diodorus of Sicily, and Plutarch are the main sources for this tradition, while later Christian authors, attacking pagan religion, sometimes preserved valuable details by citing Egyptian myths as examples of extreme or shocking behaviour. Magical texts from the Greco-Roman period also play an important role, especially because they reveal how Seth was understood in later centuries. Herodotus provides one of the earliest and most vivid descriptions connected to this conflict. He recounts a festival held at a place called Papramis, where a ritual battle formed the central event. As evening approached, priests gathered at the entrance of the temple holding wooden spears, while a crowd of worshippers armed with clubs pressed against them. On the previous day, the divine image had been carried out in a small gilded shrine and taken to another sacred building. Now, as the shrine was brought back on a four-wheeled cart, the priests attempted to block its return. The worshippers, calling on the god, struck at them, and the priests struck back. What followed was a violent clash with clubs, a ritual combat so fierce that many were said to be wounded, though the Egyptians insisted that no one died. The locals explained the origin of this ceremony through a myth. The god honoured at the festival, identified by Herodotus with Ares, had been raised away from his mother. When he returned as a grown man, he attempted to approach her, but her servants, not recognising him, drove him away. He then returned with armed supporters, forced his way past the servants, and entered his mother's presence. This, they said, was the origin of the ritual fight. The language Herodotus uses is ambiguous, but the implication of a sexual violation is difficult to avoid. Elsewhere, he explicitly denies that sexual acts took place in Egyptian temples, which suggests that he believed the Papramis story involved something exceptional and disturbing. Many modern scholars have therefore suspected that this festival preserved a distorted memory of an Egyptian myth involving incest and conflict. Attempts to connect this ritual directly with the famous struggle of Horus and Seth have long been made. The violent clash of opposing groups around a divine image closely resembles other Egyptian ritual combats, especially those associated with Osiris festivals. However, the identification of the god as Ares complicates matters. In Greek thought, Ares was primarily a war god, while in Egyptian religion the closest equivalent would normally be a deity associated with battle and aggression, rather than with Osiris himself. Some have argued that the figure Herodotus calls Ares may actually reflect Seth, especially since the hippopotamus, an animal linked with Seth, in later periods, was sacred in the region of Papremis. The location of Papremis itself remains uncertain. Herodotus places it somewhere in the delta, and later evidence suggests it lay in the northwestern region, near places strongly associated with Horus, such as Chemis and Buto. This geographical context strengthens the idea that the ritual drew on Horus traditions, rather than on the Osiris myth alone. The name of the town has been much debated, with proposals linking it to fish, marshes, or even a personal name meaning the Northern Man. None of these explanations is fully secure, but a delta setting is generally accepted. The sexual element in the Papremis ritual has no clear parallel in the Osiris festivals known from Egyptian sources. This has led some scholars to suggest that Greek interpretation reshaped the original meaning. Others argue that the rite reflects a lesser-known episode from the Horus cycle, namely a myth in which Horus violates his mother. Such an episode is attested in Egyptian magical texts and later traditions, even if it was never central to temple theology. The title, Bull of his mother, applied to several Egyptian gods including Horus, Min, and Amun, often carries sexual overtones and points toward myths of divine incest connected with fertility and kingship. Support for this interpretation comes from other Egyptian festivals. In a late inscription from the region of Buto, a god identified with Min and Horus is carried on a wheeled shrine while enemies attempt to block his movement. A ritual battle follows, and unlike the Papremis festival, deaths are openly acknowledged. Although the details differ, the basic pattern is similar: a divine image on a wheeled platform, opposition by hostile forces, and a violent clash symbolizing danger and eventual triumph. The repetition of this pattern across different cults suggests a shared ritual language rather than a single unique event. Taken together, these parallels make it likely that the Papremis festival dramatized an episode from the Horus tradition, reshaped through local practice and Greek interpretation. The mythic core appears to involve conflict around a vulnerable divine figure, maternal protection, and an act of transgression that provokes violence. Even if some details were misunderstood or exaggerated by Greek observers, the central theme remains recognizably Egyptian. Herodotus also recounts another story linked to Horus, this time centered on Chemis, which he describes as a floating island. According to the Egyptians, when Typhon searched everywhere for the child of Osiris, Isis entrusted the infant Horus to another goddess, who hid him on this island, causing it to float. Herodotus openly expresses skepticism, yet he preserves the explanation that Apollo, Artemis, and their mother correspond to Horus, Bubastis, and Isis. This account clearly blends Egyptian and Greek elements. The idea of a floating island is well known from Greek mythology, especially the story of Delos, which floated before being anchored so that a goddess could give birth there. In Egypt, no native text describes Chemis as floating, though the place was famous as the hidden birthplace of Horus in the papyrus marshes of the Delta. The Greek settlers in Egypt, familiar with the Delos myth, may have transferred its imagery onto Chemis, especially since the local goddess of Buto shared traits with Leto as a divine nurse. Whether the story originated in Egypt or Greece is difficult to determine. What is clear is that Chemis was firmly associated with the childhood of Horus, hidden among reeds and protected from Seth. This image proved powerful and enduring. It later influenced other traditions about threatened divine or heroic children, including stories outside Egypt, where a future savior or ruler must be concealed at birth to escape destruction. Herodotus also presents Horus and Seth as divine kings of a remote past. In his account, Horus is the last god to rule Egypt before the age of human kings, having defeated Typhon and driven him out. This reflects an ancient Egyptian idea that gods ruled before humans, preserved in king lists and temple traditions. Other sources place a group known as the followers of Horus between the age of gods and the first human dynasty. These traditions emphasize the political importance of Horus as a divine model of kingship. Seth too appears as a divine ruler in these accounts, though always as a rival or usurper. Greek authors often equated him with Typhon, a chaotic and destructive figure associated with deserts, storms, and foreign lands. By the time of classical writers, Seth was firmly linked with disorder and exile, pushed to the margins of the world. References to him hiding near desolate lakes or border regions reflect this symbolic banishment rather than precise geography. Diodorus of Sicily offers a different perspective by retelling the Osiris myth in two distinct ways. In one version, Osiris is a human king who civilizes Egypt before being murdered by his brother Typhon. His body is dismembered and distributed among the conspirators. Isis, aided by her son Horus, avenges him, defeats Typhon, and assumes rule. This version reads like a historical legend shaped into myth. Elsewhere, however, Diodorus presents a cosmic interpretation. Osiris becomes the sun, Isis the moon, and their actions symbolize the workings of the universe. The dismemberment of Osiris reflects the waning of the moon, while the conflict with Typhon represents destructive forces in nature. These explanations are clearly influenced by Greek philosophical allegory, rather than by Egyptian theology. In Diodorus's account, Horus plays a relatively minor role. One striking detail is the claim that Horus was killed by the followers of Typhon and then restored to life by Isis through magic. Egyptian texts never describe Horus as dying in this way. This episode likely arises from confusion with the death and resurrection of Osiris himself. Such blending of figures is not unusual in later retellings. Diodorus also describes temple reliefs, showing monstrous beings with many bodies being defeated by Osiris and allied gods. These figures are best understood as the enemies of Seth, often depicted in Egyptian art as chaotic forces that can appear in multiple animal forms. Rather than literal giants, they represent the many shapes of disorder that must be overcome by divine authority. Plutarch, writing later, provides the most elaborate narrative of the conflict. He adds new episodes, such as Osiris returning after death to train Horus for battle and testing his sense of justice. Horus declares that avenging parents is the noblest of all acts. The conflict lasts many days, alliances shift, and even Seth's consort defects to Horus. Eventually, Seth is captured, but Isis spares him, provoking Horus's anger. In a moment of rage, Horus tears the royal crown from his mother's head, an episode that echoes harsher Egyptian versions in which Isis is violently punished. Plutarch also includes a formal trial where Seth accuses Horus of illegitimacy. Through divine advocacy, Horus is vindicated and ultimately triumphs. A younger form of Horus is then born, weak and premature, reflecting a later theological development in which Horus appears as a child god. Many of Plutarch's details have partial parallels in Egyptian texts, though none match his narrative exactly. Accusations against Horus, his weakness in youth, and Isis's magical conception after Osiris's death all appear in various forms in native sources. Other elements, such as Horus riding a horse, reflect later historical realities, rather than ancient myth. Plutarch goes further by interpreting the myth on multiple levels. He discusses historical, cosmic, and moral readings, treating the gods as symbols of natural forces or ethical principles. While he presents these interpretations as respectful insight, They owe more to Greek philosophy than to Egyptian belief. Yet through these layers of explanation, the core remains visible. A struggle over legitimacy, order, and rightful rule. Across Greek and Roman writings, the conflict of Horus and Seth survives not as a single clear story, but as a shifting set of images. Ritual battles, floating islands, divine kings, cosmic allegories, and moral lessons all coexist. Each author reshapes the myth according to his own cultural framework. Yet beneath these reinterpretations lies the enduring Egyptian vision of conflict resolved through divine justice, where chaos is confronted, legitimacy is tested, and order is finally restored. At one point, the moon itself is said to veil the sun, making it vanish on the 30th day of the month. Yet this disappearance is never complete, just as Isis did not utterly destroy Typhon. The comparison is imperfect because in other interpretations Osiris, not Isis, is identified with the moon. Another explanation proposes that Typhon is not the sun at all, but the shadow of the earth into which the moon falls during an eclipse. In this view, eclipse and injury become parallel events, rather than acts of destruction. Other cosmic readings follow a similar logic. The eyes of Horus are sometimes understood as the sun and the moon together, or alternatively, Osiris is equated with the sun while Isis becomes the moon. Egyptian tradition later developed the idea that the wounding of the eye of Horus reflected the monthly waning of the moon, while more severe damage symbolized a lunar eclipse. These interpretations do not simply reflect Greek philosophy imposed from outside. They align with forms of Egyptian speculation that appear in later religious texts, where celestial events are woven into mythic language. Vegetation imagery also plays a role. In one explanation, Osiris is the Nile itself, uniting with the earth embodied by Isis, while Typhon represents the sea into which the river disappears. Other interpretations broaden this idea, presenting Osiris as the source of all moisture and growth, and Typhon as everything dry, burning, and destructive. Horus gains strength from mist and cloud, and his victory over Typhon symbolizes timely rain and the Nile's triumph over the sea, allowing fertile land to reappear beneath fresh deposits. Plutarch treats the agricultural readings with some irony, noting how readily people reduce divine drama to sowing and harvest cycles. Still, by the later periods of Egyptian religion, Osiris was firmly linked with fertility, even if this was not part of his earliest identity as Lord of the Dead. Plutarch himself prefers a moral interpretation. In his view, Typhon represents destructive and chaotic forces in nature, while Osiris embodies intelligence, order, and beneficent rule. All harmful animals, plants, and events are traced to Typhon's influence, while harmony and reason belong to Osiris and Isis. From this perspective, the myth teaches that disorder arises from excess and imbalance, while goodness is defined by measure and structure. Even minor episodes are read symbolically. When Hermes is said to have cut the sinews of Typhon and used them as strings for his lyre, the lesson becomes one of reason transforming chaos into harmony. References to statues showing Horus holding the severed genitals of Typhon are interpreted less literally, likely reflecting imagery associated with other fertility gods, rather than a historical memory of violence. Modern assessments of Plutarch emphasize that his work is layered. Some elements are purely Greek, others reflect late Egyptian traditions, and a few preserve echoes of much older beliefs. His account is invaluable for understanding how the Osiris myth was understood in the centuries just before his own time, even if it cannot be taken as a straightforward guide to the religion of the Old Kingdom. Much of its philosophical depth is the product of Greek thought applied to Egyptian material. Certain passages even resemble ideas found in later Gnostic systems. where imperfect creation arises from error and matter is seen as flawed from its origin. These themes do not belong to traditional Egyptian theology, but they show how the myth was reinterpreted in a changing intellectual world. Christian writers approached the story with different aims. It served their arguments to claim that pagan gods were once mortal rulers, and several early authors present Horus, Osiris, and Seth as former kings rather than true deities. Brief summaries of the Osiris myth appear in Christian polemics, often distorted by moral outrage, especially over incest. In one version, Typhon is presented as the husband of Isis, enraged when he discovers her relationship with Osiris. Such retellings reveal more about the author's discomfort than about Egyptian belief. In these Christian accounts, Horus plays a minor role. When he appears, it is usually as a son who grows up, defeats his uncle, and restores order. The tone is dismissive. If gods can be murdered, flee in fear, or fail to protect themselves, then they cannot truly be divine. The myth becomes an argument against pagan worship rather than a story to be understood on its own terms. Yet the image of Horus as a divine warrior proved remarkably persistent. In late Egyptian and early Christian art, mounted figures spearing crocodiles or monsters appear, blending older Horus imagery with new forms. Some reliefs show a hawk-headed rider in military dress, trampling a beast beneath his horse. While Horus was never depicted on horseback in pharaonic art, Roman influence transformed him into a warrior figure closer to later saints. It is not unreasonable to see in these images a distant ancestor of figures like St. George, whose combat with the dragon echoes much older stories of divine victory over chaos. Magical objects from Egypt show even more complex mixtures. Some gems depict a figure standing on a crocodile while holding a fish crowned with light, merging Horus imagery with Christian symbolism. Others combine Horus-like poses with foreign divine names, blending Egyptian, Jewish, and Gnostic traditions into a single image. In several magical texts, Seth himself appears not as an enemy, but as a powerful ally, master of dark forces whose strength can be harnessed. His older role as defender of the sun seems to underlie these contradictions. One area where the influence of the Horus myth is unmistakable is in images of mother and child. Artistic traditions associated with Isis nursing Horus shaped later depictions of the Virgin and child. Over time, multiple maternal figures merged into a single visual language of protection, nourishment, and divine legitimacy. Beyond classical and Christian sources, other traditions also preserve fragments of the myth. Greek stories describe how the gods fled from Typhon into Egypt, disguising themselves as animals. These tales likely aimed to explain Egyptian animal worship, while also reflecting the identification of Greek and Egyptian gods. Another ancient writer mentions a gathering place of the gods abandoned when Typhon ruled, perhaps echoing Egyptian stories of divine councils resisting Seth. Some versions even describe formal trials, where Horus is judged for acts committed against his mother. These episodes reflect distorted memories of Egyptian myths in which violence within the divine family was never entirely suppressed. Magical papyri preserve yet another perspective, invoking Horus's victory to protect individuals, while at the same time calling upon Seth's terrifying power when destructive force is required. The idea that the right eye of Horus represents the sun, and the left eye, the moon, became influential only at a relatively late stage. This interpretation is often linked to stories in which Typhon discovers the coffin of Osiris during a hunt at the time of the full moon, and to rituals involving the sacrifice of a pig on that same lunar phase. Certain funerary spells speak of restoring what was missing from the eye before a festival day arrives. yet earlier versions place this restoration on a different day altogether. Because of these inconsistencies, it is difficult to claim that the eye originally carried a clear lunar meaning. The connection with the moon appears to be a later reinterpretation rather than a foundational element of the myth. Some scholars have attempted to explain the conflict between Horus and Seth as a symbolic struggle between light and darkness, reflected in the waxing and waning of the moon. In this view, the damaged eye of Horus is the moon itself, losing and regaining its brightness in a perpetual cycle. More recent reassessments, however, have acknowledged that the earliest meaning of the eye was political rather than cosmic. The eye originally symbolized royal authority, expressed through the crowns of Egypt. Only later did this symbol merge with celestial imagery, once Horus was fully identified with the sky and with the sun god. Attempts to locate a fully developed moon myth in the earliest texts have not been convincing. While Horus is often given solar or celestial traits, in early sources there is no consistent portrayal of him as a lunar deity at this stage. In some early passages, Seth himself even appears as a source of light rather than darkness. His later association with shadow and night seems to have developed only after he was linked with demonic figures representing chaos and obscurity. What emerges from this is a layered process in which older political symbols were gradually overlaid with cosmic and astral meanings. Over time, several astral explanations were proposed. One interpretation saw the myth as a description of a lunar eclipse, imagining a monstrous force devouring the moon. Another, more widely accepted view interpreted it as a reflection of the regular waxing and waning of the moon. A third approach placed the historical conflict at the centre and argued that the celestial readings arose later, when the political struggle was projected onto the heavens. A fourth explanation framed the conflict as a clash between storm and clear sky, presenting Seth as a storm deity and Horus as a god of light. Yet even this model encounters contradictions, since Seth was also associated with certain stars and with protective roles linked to the sun. What becomes clear is that the astral interpretations are secondary. They grew out of theological speculation, particularly in centres that emphasized solar theology. Even in texts strongly influenced by such ideas, traces of the original political conflict remain visible. The myth was never purely cosmic at its core. Another line of interpretation treated the story as a vegetation myth, casting Osiris as fertile water and Seth as the barren desert. While such associations did develop over time, the earliest texts do not support a clear opposition of this kind. These readings belong primarily to later, philosophical interpretations, rather than to the original structure of the myth. A moral interpretation is even further removed from the beginnings of the story. For long periods of Egyptian history, Seth was honoured as a powerful and legitimate god. Only in much later eras did he come to embody evil in a moral sense. Earlier, Egyptian tradition does not present him as a devil figure, even when he is portrayed as violent or disruptive. The fully moralized opposition between good and evil emerges only under foreign influence and in late religious texts. The conflict between Horus and Seth was not only told but also enacted. Ritual dramas reenacted their struggle in temples and festivals. Some scholars have attempted to place this ritual combat within a broader Near Eastern pattern, comparing it to myths of divine battles found in Mesopotamia and the Levant. Yet these comparisons overlook a fundamental difference. In those traditions, the combat is primarily cosmological, tied to the creation of the world itself. In Egypt, by contrast, the conflict centers on kingship and legitimate rule. The struggle is about who has the right to govern, not about the formation of the cosmos. Closer parallels are found in myths that explain the possession of land or authority, rather than the creation of the universe. In this sense, the Egyptian story resembles disputes between rival gods over specific territories. The loss of power suffered by one figure, sometimes symbolized through mutilation, reflects political defeat rather than cosmic destruction. The earliest and most important sources for the conflict are the pyramid texts. These texts already preserve the story as something ancient, suggesting that the events they reflect predate the kings whose tombs they adorn. The conflict must therefore be earlier than the end of the 5th dynasty. Whether it occurred in early dynastic times or even before the dynasties began remains an open question. Archaeological evidence shows that symbols associated with both Horus and Seth appear in pre-dynastic contexts. Falcon imagery emerges clearly during the later phases of pre-dynastic culture and is unmistakably religious in character. The Seth animal also appears very early, though its religious meaning is harder to establish at first. By the late pre-dynastic period, both deities seem to have been important, though not necessarily opposed. Objects such as ceremonial palettes and mace heads depict animal deities destroying fortified towns and subduing enemies. These scenes point to real conflicts between groups, remembered and mythologized through divine symbolism. In some cases, falcons, scorpions, and other animal gods appear together, suggesting alliances rather than rivalries. The evidence indicates that multiple powers participated in campaigns that eventually led to the unification of Egypt. Just before the reign of the first dynastic kings, Horus and Seth appear together as tutelary figures within an Upper Egyptian coalition. This suggests that their conflict must belong to an earlier phase before these alliances formed. It also raises the possibility that either god may once have been associated with different regions of the country. Later, historical periods saw renewed tensions reflected in royal symbolism. Certain kings emphasized Seth, others Horus, and in rare cases both together. Some scholars have argued that these shifts reflect internal struggles within Egypt during the 2nd dynasty. While this interpretation makes creative use of the evidence, it remains speculative. Religious preference does not necessarily imply political rebellion. What can be said with confidence is that the myth of Horus and Seth preserves the memory of real struggles for power in Egypt's formative age. These struggles were later reshaped, reinterpreted, and layered with cosmic, moral, and philosophical meanings. Yet beneath all these later readings lies an older narrative, one rooted in conflict, reconciliation, and the creation of kingship itself. Some researchers have argued that the famous story of conflict and reconciliation between Horus and Seth was shaped into a tidy official narrative quite late, perhaps around the reign of Khâsekhemoui or shortly afterward. In that view, royal theologians looked back on relatively recent political unrest and organized it into a legendary history, turning real tensions into a structured myth of rivalry, followed by unity. Yet a deeper problem appears immediately. The evidence for the idea is already present far earlier than this, and it is difficult to explain those early traces unless some form of conflict was remembered before the dynastic state was fully established. One of the strongest clues comes from an early royal title, used for queens. The wording of that title assumes that Horus and Seth both belong inside the ideology of kingship itself, not as separate rivals outside the system. It points to a settled peace, yes, but it also quietly presupposes that peace came after something else. A title that celebrates balance only makes sense if people still remembered a prior imbalance. If the story were merely a late invention to explain Second Dynasty turmoil, it would be strange to find such a confident expression of duality at the very beginning of the dynastic period. The title functions like a fossil. It preserves an older political memory inside later court language. Another heavy piece of evidence appears in a theological tradition that treats the gods as rulers of the two regions of Egypt. In one version, a first decision divides the country between Horus and Seth, assigning each a portion. In a second decision, the division is overturned and Horus becomes sole ruler of the entire land. What matters here is not only the story itself, but the assumptions behind it. Horus is presented as the traditional lord of the north, even though the historical unification remembered from early royal monuments is associated with power rising from the south. That mismatch suggests that Horus had already been linked with the north before the southern victory that created the dynastic order. The simplest explanation is that an older tradition remembered Horus as a northern power in an earlier phase of conquest or dominance, a phase later absorbed into a larger national story. Debate over the date of that theological composition has never fully settled. Some arguments place it early, close to the first dynastic generations. Others place it later, when Memphis became the ideological heart of the kingdom and when northern traditions could be more consciously articulated. Even if the text in its final form belongs to a later stage, its core ideas could still preserve much older political assumptions. Parts of such works often carry different layers, and the oldest layer is not always the easiest to date. The crucial point remains. Whether the tradition was first written down early or somewhat later, it continues to describe Horus and Seth as the divine labels of two competing regions, and it treats the struggle as something already ancient. Then comes the question of how to interpret the second verdict, the one that grants the whole kingdom to Horus. One persuasive way to read it is as a reflection of the dynastic unification traditionally associated with Menes. Yet even here the picture is not so simple. Seth does not vanish from early royal ideology. He appears alongside Horus in late pre-dynastic imagery. He survives in royal titles and formulae in the earliest dynasties. And he continues to have priesthoods and cult centres tied to major political landscapes. In other words, a complete theological erasure of Seth does not match what is known from early royal symbolism. Horus may stand at the top, but the language of unity still makes room for Seth as a partner, or at least as a force that must be included in the definition of kingship. This makes it likely that the fusion of Horus and Seth in the idea of the king did not begin with the dynastic conquest from the south. It points instead to an earlier coalescence between two political zones, one marked by Horus and one marked by Seth, that had already learned to live together inside a single kingship. Only after such a fusion would it make sense to speak of the portions of Horus and Seth as a meaningful way to describe the country. The myth's trial scenes, where inheritance and rightful rule are debated, may preserve a memory of arbitration, not simply conquest, but a settlement that defined boundaries, shares, and legitimacy. In later retellings, this settlement could be expressed through divine judgment, and in some versions the settlement ends, not with division, but with reunification under one authority. A plausible sequence begins to take shape when the layers are placed side by side. First, Horus and Seth belong to separate local cult centres, likely small political communities. Over time, their influence spreads and wider coalitions form, especially as the north becomes a major arena of growth and power. Conflict follows, and the land becomes imagined as divided into two portions associated with the two gods. After further struggle comes a unification that recognises both deities inside the kingship. Later still, unity breaks again, and a second unification is achieved under a more exclusively Horian banner, this time linked with southern supremacy. Even then, the older dual theology is not fully erased. It continues to reappear because it expresses something that Egyptians continue to feel as true. The country's unity was built out of rival powers that had once stood apart. This reconstruction, however, immediately meets a serious objection. Some archaeologists argue that there is no clear evidence for an early, advanced northern kingdom dominating the south. Excavations in the delta do not easily yield a picture of a superior or older state that could have subdued Upper Egypt. Symbols traditionally associated with the north sometimes appear first in southern contexts. Major northern sites may have been colonized from the south, rather than leading southern development. Another argument claims that much of the delta was too marshy in the earliest periods to support dense settlement and complex political organization. Yet the matter is not so easily closed. Marshes do not exclude margins, ridges, and habitable spurs. Large wetlands can still support human life on their edges, and in some environments they can even encourage concentrated settlement where stable ground exists. There is also reason to think that the delta's deep layers, buried beneath later deposits, may conceal very early material that has not been recovered. Excavations at northern sites have produced evidence of substantial communities, even if the material record still makes direct comparison with Upper Egypt difficult. The archaeological silence may reflect the difficulty of excavation and preservation as much as it reflects the real absence of early northern power. The geography of cult centres complicates things further. Horus is strongly linked in early religious geography with northern places, while the political unification associated with early kings seems to rise from a southern base. One famous northern sanctuary, tied to Horus, becomes important in later tradition, but it is not prominent in the earliest pyramid inscriptions. Those early texts often speak not of large capitals, but of the villages of Horus and the villages of Seth, suggesting a landscape of small communities rather than a fully organized state. At the same time, one southern center connected with Horus stands out with unusual force, Hierakonpolis. The material discoveries there, and the way later royal ideology remembers both a northern and a southern sacred center, strongly suggest that the southern conquest that created the dynastic state was launched from that region. Seth, meanwhile, shows deep early roots in Upper Egypt, yet he also has an early and persistent presence in the northeast delta. Some scholars try to push him toward Libyan or desert origins. Others try to separate him into multiple deities, one northern and one southern, each with different mythological roles. These theories can be ingenious, but they often depend on weak links and uncertain identifications. What the evidence supports more securely is a simpler picture. Seth was never only a southern god and never only a northern god. His cult had multiple centers, and his political meaning could shift with time and circumstance. At this point, another older reconstruction enters the debate, one that turns the entire combined story of Osiris, Horus, and Seth into literal political history. It imagines multiple pre-dynastic unions, rebellions, and reconquests, with Osiris treated as an ancient human king, later deified. The trouble is that the Osiris story does not behave like a historical legend, in the same way the Horus-Seth conflict does. Osiris appears early as ruler of the dead, not as a remembered human monarch. Greek writers sometimes describe him as an ancient king, but that is not enough to turn the Egyptian tradition into straight history. The combined myth is composite. The conflict between Horus and Seth can stand alone and likely began as a self-contained political legend. The Osiris story attaches to it later and transforms its tone, but it does not supply the original historical core. Behind all these arguments lies a question about the kind of society that produced the myth. The trial scenes revolve around inheritance, legitimacy, and succession. The language assumes a system where descent and through the father mattered, where the right of the son to inherit was central, and where authority could be argued and judged. Claims that early Egyptian society was based on descent through the mother are often repeated, yet the logic of the succession drama suggests a strong patrilineal framework, at least in late pre-dynastic and early dynastic ideology. Royal marriage practices, including possible unions within the family, may have been driven less by ordinary social custom and more by a sacred doctrine of kingship, where the royal line sought to preserve a unique sanctity. The myth also reflects the birth of one of the earliest nation-states. Egypt's unification produced a centralized authority earlier than many neighboring regions, where city-states remained separate for long periods. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine the pre-dynastic landscape as already centralized in the later sense. The earliest rulers were likely local chieftains, forming federations under divine symbols and recognizing a leading figure among them. The earliest crowns and royal emblems point to some kind of union, but not necessarily to a tightly administered state. The old phrase about the portions of the gods may even preserve a memory older than kingship itself. Before private property became dominant, land in many early societies was treated as communal, and then allocated by authority, divided among families as shares. The language of portioning fits that kind of world. Later, the same language can be used for inheritance and legal division, but its roots may lie in an older system of communal land and tribal allocation. In this sense, the divine portions echo a deep social memory. The land is not only conquered, it is divided, assigned, and made legitimate through recognized authority.